right. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this Listen and Learn lecture that, as I mentioned before, with the announcement, is going to cover the second half portion of last week's class. So we'll pick up where we left off, where I end for today. But what we are going to do is definitely go ahead and get started with having this discussion because it's an important and in-depth discussion for us to have in an effort to fully understand just how we operate and how we function in a professional environment, especially matched up against other individuals, other companies, other countries, more specifically, that have their own cultural patterns, their own cultural way of doing things, their own cultural behavior, their own cultural climate. So, culture at a glance consists of your individual attitude, beliefs, and value systems, as we talked about before. And it also defines who you are as an individual. Everyone has their own individual cultural DNA or cultural identity. Culture also influences our worldview, which has a lot to do with the way that we see the world, the way that we see the world matched up against ourselves and also matched up against others. And it's also more of a learned behavior. And it also, in essence, shapes the way that we judge and observe other cultures. So culture is a very powerful component because not only is it a learned behavior in terms of how we constantly evolve with our attitudes, beliefs, and value systems, but it also has much to do with the type of employee that we become, the type of professional we become, the type of personality that we develop, and how we perceive others and how well we work with others. Our worldview, in a lot of cases, has a lot to do with our perception with regard to whether or not we overgeneralize things with certain groups of people. We make vague assumptions based on our own assumptions, or our own observations, rather. We make vague assumptions based on our own experiences in life. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, our worldview has to expand. And the entire premise behind our class, our business speech class, and the entire premise behind expanding our own cultural horizons means being more open-minded and at the same time being more of a conscious communicator, being focused on the fact that we all communicate differently and for different reasons. So let's take a closer look at the United States and culture. Our country as a whole is more of an individualistic culture in terms of our cultural behavior, because ultimately what consists of who we are as an individual, especially regarding the social component when it comes to our continuum and who we are, the personal social identity continuum. That's where I'm getting up. Got a little brain tied there. But our personal social identity continuum has much to do with who we are as a person, as an individual, having an influence on other groups, and how those other groups have an influence on us. Well, our cultural behaviors and our cultural norms comes from the groups that we are surrounded by on a daily basis. And our normal pattern and way of operating and functioning has much to do with ultimately who we are, and who we are, in this case, as a country, who we are as a city that expands to who we are as a state, who we are as a country. All of them have a significant impact, one from the other. So when it comes to an individualistic cultural behavior, what that means is that we have the power and the ability to ultimately define who we are and make our own decisions with what we want to do in life. And we're going to take a closer look at each of these in a moment. We're also a low context culture, and at the same time, a low power distance cultural behavior. So let's take a closer look at the difference between the three. Individualistic cultures tend to put their own interests and those of immediate family ahead of social concerns. Also encourages freedom that allows individuals to achieve personal success. So we have that personal right and opportunity to make our own decisions with what we want to do with our lives. It's not predicated largely like a high context culture would be on what your family says that you should do. or what you're expected to do with your life, with your education. And at the same time, we've got that great benefit of putting our own interests and those of immediate family ahead of social concerns, but sometimes it tends to make us a little self-centered. We as a nation tend to come together so much more effectively when we're under some type of heavy amount of stress like 9/11. When the nation really came together strong because we all had to defend ourselves against a common enemy that was threatening our very way of life, our very freedoms, our ability to have this individualistic culture. Or even when it comes to natural disasters, we tend to rally together and support one another. And those are the times that we don't put our own family ahead of social concerns, because especially if the social concerns in those particular cases can still somehow have an impact on who we are as individuals, when those are threatened or ultimately weakened somehow, it's what tends to make us band together. And we're also a low context culture, which means that we typically use language in our culture to primarily express our thoughts and feelings and ideas as clearly and logically as possible. Overall, for our culture, believe it or not, our words tend to validate or supersede our actions. So herein lies the challenge of the old cliche that we hear: do actions speak louder than words? But in essence, when you think about it, do they really? Actions, of course, are very beneficial and they do speak volumes. But what typically compels the action? What typically validates the action? Particularly in our culture, it's our words. Our words mean quite a bit, much of which, in terms of our credibility, is based on our ability to articulate our thoughts and our feelings and our ideas, as opposed to it being more of an implied rule with certain cultural behaviors or beliefs. That's just not our culture. We're more along the lines of focusing on our words and how powerful they are, and how our words compel action. If you could ever imagine being in a situation where you have a job interview of a lifetime, and when you take that seat for that job interview, you have difficulty articulating your thoughts and your cognitive ability to do the very job that you're applying for, quite naturally, that's going to make it very difficult for you to be a prime candidate for that position. So, in essence, we can think of a myriad of different things. Like if a person commits to doing something that they say they're going to do for their particular department or a particular project that they're working on, and they don't follow through, well, in essence, it's the words that compels the actual action. The words in terms of the message that's given from management or from another coworker to you, or you giving a message to someone else, it comes from the instructions, it comes from the expectations. Those words are very significant with regard to how that project comes out, or the outcome of that project, or the expectations of that particular project, which in essence would be the action. So we have to think carefully about this one. And this is where I get very concerned, because we are what's considered to be a microwave society. We get information quick and fast, and we'll process it quick and fast. But in the grand scheme of doing both of those things, there are moments that we miss out on the most impactful part of that person's message, or the most impactful part of what message we're supposed to be receiving or processing or understanding, because we get things quick and fast and we process them. And there are times that we also, we deliver written messages to the point that we don't always spell check or check our grammatical errors or our spelling overall, our use of punctuation. It might just be this misspelling of one word in a sentence, or it might just be the grammatical issues involving the entire sentence itself, also known as syntax. So we could have syntax errors all over the place because we're in such a hurry to type or convey our written message that we don't take the time to think about, well, whether it's properly laid out grammatically, whether it has proper grammatical structure, or whether it's free of any misspellings. That speaks very significant amount of credibility to who you are, especially in a professional environment. So I highly urge you, especially because we're part of this low context culture in our country, I highly urge you to work to expand your vocabulary. And at the same time, look to find ways to structure your sentences in a way that's better understood and comprehended and free of misspellings, free of grammatical errors. Always use spell check. If there's an important letter that you have to compose or a resume you're putting together, always make sure that someone who's a professional in that area is able to take a look at it and critique you to make sure that it's in the direction that it needs to be. So for our class, we're going to take a close look at resumes and what they're supposed to look like, as well as cover letters and how they should be structured. It largely depends on what your field of study is, and most importantly, making sure that it's consistent. That there's consistency there. That you have, like, say for example, if you have the times that you worked at one particular job and you just write out SCPT for September, but then on the next line for another job you actually write out September. Well, that's a lack of consistency as far as that's concerned. And what those words convey when there's misspellings and lack of consistencies on a resume, for example, or even a cover letter for that matter, is it gives the impression that you're not the type of person that takes their time to really accurately follow through with what they're composing, or more importantly, that you are not detailed oriented. Okay, so being detail oriented means that you take the time to look at your messages, your verbal messages, in terms of thinking about how you're going to articulate something before you say it, and at the same time composing your message in terms of writing. So yes, our words, even though it's only 10 to 15% of how we communicate, that doesn't mean that it's not a significant impact. It just so happens that when it comes to nonverbal communication, there are more ways for us to communicate. Facial expressions, eye contact, posture, use of our hand gestures, our attire, what we wear, our artifacts, like what you see behind me, these pictures on the wall, this calendar. All these are elements. This mirror are examples of artifacts. Those are ultimately things that not so much relics, but they in the communication world, they help to define who we are. They're an extension of our personality, of our identity. And that's a nonverbal communication component. If you think about it in the sense that nonverbal communication involves any way that we convey our message of our identity, of who we are, of the type of person that we are, type of personality we possess, without saying a single word. And at the same time, it speaks volumes to how a company is represented without saying a single word, how a company's image appears, whether it's nice landscaping on the outside of a building, whether that building is clean and washed, what do the people inside of the building look like, how do they dress, how do they interact with one another. When words are not expressed, that's all nonverbal communication. But ladies and gentlemen, it does not take away from how valid, how significant our words are to the overall outcome of our success. Okay, so that's something that we have to continue to work on harnessing and perfecting the use of our words. We're also a low power distance culture. Anyone is given the opportunity to hold a position of power. This is a great benefit for us in our country because we don't live in one of those type of third world countries, for example, where only people who were born into leadership positions, only their families and their family's family can ever find themselves being the being an inheritance to those positions, or ultimately being the benefactor to those positions. We're not part of a culture such as that, where just because of our background and our upbringing does not determine where we are going to go in life. It does not determine that. It's not predicated on our past or our family. anyone in our country, which is what makes our country as great as it is. But it's just that we have to actually fight for that in some cases, because not everyone is necessarily given the same type of opportunity to hold a position of power. And then what that position of power looks like, those are some of the challenges that we're still fighting, whether it has to do with your gender or your ethnic association, whether you're considered to be white or black or Hispanic or Asian, any of those particular groups. And with regard to the groups that we belong to, the so-called marginalized groups among us are those that have limited opportunity for advancement and for leadership. Dr. Martin Luther King, when he talked about equality, for example, he specifically said that it's not a matter of having equal access to, going to the same school or equal access to working the same job, but equal access to power, equal access to resources, and equal access to responsibility. And everyone has equal access to the same type of resources, not just, you and I are going to the same school, but you still got better resources than I do. Or you and I live in the same neighborhood, but you still have a greater level of access to power than I do. Or better still, with regard to responsibility. The only way for this formula to work when it comes to anyone given the opportunity to hold a position of power is that we shouldn't all have to fight for it in different ways because of what we look like. Like a woman shouldn't have to fight 5 times as hard to be accepted if she's just as cognitively experienced or well equipped for holding a position of leadership or power or whatever that position happens to be, if her colleague happens to be a man. She shouldn't have to fight and work 5 times as hard in order to, it's like, yeah, I'll give you the opportunity and I'll give you the opportunity to hold this position, but you got to fight and work 5 times as hard to maintain it. That's where the fairness and the equality needs better balance. Well, the same thing when it comes to ethnic groups like Blacks or Hispanics or Asians that may not be given the same level of opportunity. So the whole operative component here also involves everyone given the same level of opportunity and the same level of treatment, the same level of respect, the same level of acknowledgement. The operative word that is missing in our country when it comes to us being a low power distance culture, while yes, our background does not determine or our family upbringing does not determine our opportunities, but at the same time, because of our ethnic origin or our gender association or even age for that matter, because ageism is an issue just as much as racism or gender issues and challenges that we face when it comes to inequalities and inopportunities that are just simply not there. Lack of opportunities because of our demographic makeup is an unethical and immoral platform that we as a nation of people that are united, we're still dealing with that challenge. Things are improving, but we still have more room for improvement. When deemed necessary in our culture, challenging positions of power and or authority is also encouraged. So what that means in essence is that we're not of a nation that if you, like say for example, in Chinese culture or in Latin culture, if a teacher says something and whatever they say, even if you're in disagreement, you cannot challenge that authority. So if you have something to say, you have to pretty much hold it to yourself because otherwise it's considered to be disrespecting that person in leadership and authority. Because after all, if they were not competent enough to hold that position of leadership or power or position of power, they would not have been appointed that. That's the idea or the belief. But for our country, for our culture, if there's something that you disagree with that I say, then by all means, with a respectful approach, challenge me. I mean, of course, here's the deal. There's nothing wrong with challenging people because nobody's perfect. It's just a matter of your approach with how you do it. That's what's important. Not to disrespect a person or ultimately demean them or consider them or straight out call them out for being incompetent. That's one thing you definitely don't want to do in a workplace, for example, is if you have a boss or manager who you believe is incompetent or incapable of doing their job, if they're still in a position and have the ability to fire you or to demote you, that's not the best way to do that. That's definitely not advisable. However, you can attract more flies with honey than vinegar, which simply means that there is a more proactive approach. If there's something that you disagree with, let them know respectfully so why you disagree with something, and give them an alternative or explain what you propose to be a solution in terms of taking the initiative. So when it's deemed necessary, we can challenge positions of power and authority. It's encouraged because what it does is it shows that you have the ability to take initiative, that if you see something that needs to be fixed or resolved or ultimately that you disagree with, then if the person in position of power and authority is in reasonable acceptance of criticism, and the operative word there is reasonable acceptance of criticism. That means that they're pretty open to it, but it's just a matter of how you approach it. With the understanding that in a high power distance culture, this is just something that you don't absolutely do at all. You absolutely do not challenge people in positions of power and authority because it can not only bring shame upon you, but in some instances, it can bring shame upon the entire family and embarrassment. Like in Japanese culture, for example, or even Chinese culture, where you challenge people in positions of power and authority, it can be deemed very disrespectful and dishonorable. So again, it's why it's also important for us to understand that not everyone, in terms of our worldview, communicates the same way across the globe. I remember growing up having some of my friends that were about my age, and it was really funny how some of the friends that never really traveled beyond their city, their worldview in terms of how things functioned and operated, they were under the impression that when they traveled to another city, that everything was supposed to look the same exact way as the city where they came from. Now, mind you, this is the mindset of a child. Okay, we're talking about the mindset of an 11-year-old who's never seen any place else before. Or there were some of my friends that they kind of assume that places look different, when you go from, say, Houston to Dallas. But there was the assumption that whatever radio stations existed here in Houston were the same exact radio stations in Dallas. Same exact format, same exact channel. And the same thing went for television as well. But when they began to travel more and they began to see more of the world outside of their own environment, their own normal environment, and began to understand that things look different, people look different, talk different, function and operate different. Cities have their own different cultures. Companies have their own different cultures in terms of their attitudes, beliefs, and values. But that's why it's important to learn about them. Speaking of which, when you get ready to investigate, and I say investigate because this is something you should definitely do. When you get ready to look into the type of company that you want to work for, and I'm talking about especially when it's a career, like it could very well be a lifetime opportunity, someplace that you might stay with for a number of years, to gain experience and to gain a family and ultimately to gain a career. You got to investigate. In other words, look into, research that company, find out what type of culture they possess. Are they more of a traditional management run company, or do they take more of the human relations approach? Or maybe they're a mixture of between the two, where in some instances they operate as a traditional managed run company. Maybe that's only during the times that they are looking to reach certain types of goals. Maybe it has to do with the end of fiscal year. Maybe it's because they've got to really tighten down the hatches because a major project is coming up with a very strict deadline and they just don't have time to have an open door policy. They just don't have time to listen to people's concerns and challenges and ideas because they're under a strict deadline. So that's more of the systems contingency approach to management. But understand what drives that company. Is it the people or is it the product? And make sure that whichever it is that drives that company that you're comfortable with, that you can gel more effectively with. That's a very important component when it comes to building this relationship with that company. And at the same time, if you do have ideas and concerns and things that need to be talked about or discussed, is it more of an opportunity for open floor discussion? Is management or the people that you're going to be working directly with, are they open to hearing those critiques or those concerns or those ideas when it comes to challenging a person in a position of power, not so much to challenge their position, but to challenge an idea or a concept that was developed or put into place? Because that is where ultimately we all learn and we all grow. When we're able to accept criticism, the operative component here is constructive and not destructive criticism. Constructive criticism is designed to build, destructive criticism is designed to tear down. So, of course, when it comes to this power that we have, this opportunity that we have, it's important for us to utilize it to our benefit and not to damage it or abuse it. Okay. If one of the worst things to happen, even in the learning process, in the learning environment, is that if you should challenge something that you disagree with. As I said before, none of us are perfect, and I certainly don't profess to be. If there's something that I say that you disagree with, let's talk about it so that we can get a better understanding together. Learning is a revolving door, and success should be designed that way too. No one person should be considered greater than the other just because of the position that they hold. Everyone should be acknowledged for their abilities and their contributions to that organization when they are making good, positive, strong contributions. Because without them, the company would not be as successful as it is. And I'm talking about all the way to the person considered to be the janitor or the building maintenance engineer or the people that do landscaping. If the building is not clean and it's in deplorable condition, then what does that say about the image of the company, both inside and out? Not to mention, it could be a health violation if restrooms are not cleaned or there's trash all over the place or food spilling over trash cans. It could become a serious health violation. So give everybody in every position respect and honor. So moving on now, when it comes to uncertainty avoidance, let me go back real quick. Okay, just wanted to make sure nothing was skipped. When it comes to uncertainty avoidance, it's a measure of how accepting a culture is of a lack of predictability. Cultures that accept uncertainties are able to take risks and relatively tolerant of behavior that differs from the norm. And as a result, also more open to new ideas, to new concepts, and other cultural behaviors. In other words, being more open minded and accepting of things that are different, people that are different, ideas that are different. Okay, when it comes to uncertainties, it's considered to be expected for things to take us by surprise. There are things that we just can't control in life. And there are cultures that, when it comes to dealing with uncertainties, that are more accepting of this fact. And when you're more accepting of the fact that you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days, things are not going to always be perfect, it tends to help you to better function and operate as an individual and as well as a company. Now, you're going to have ups and downs. Things are not going to always be on top. And that's why, like here in our country, we're not as keen as we should be, and well focused and committed to dealing with uncertainties as we should be, because in essence, there are those of us that really don't like negative surprises. It's like everything's good as long as it's running smoothly. And then as soon as the bottom falls out, it becomes very difficult to rebuild if you're part of a company that has the culture of, just not being able to accept uncertainties and lack of predictability, ends up causing things to go haywire. So there are things that ultimately we can't control, and the more we're focused on that, it helps us to, to spend that time more effectively rebuilding and to better adapt to that situation as opposed to allowing ourselves to succumb to the negative outcomes or consequences. So one of the dilemmas that we face when it comes to our culture, which is also known as Western cultural organizations, we're known as Western culture. Not every region views cultural behavior in the workplace as we do, as I said earlier, because that's a no-brainer. Not every region views cultural behavior in the workplace the same way we do. And when I say region, I'm talking about other countries. So other countries have their own cultural way of doing things. And our lack of respect for other cultural businesses and social practices, when we have that lack of respect, it's given us this bad name that we're still in the process of working towards fixing and resolving. And I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of this term before, but it's called the ugly American. Not a nice term. I'll tell you what it's all about in a second. And it can also hinder our professional relationship in the global market if we neglect to recognize and respect other cultural norms. So when it comes to respecting other cultural norms, it first comes from learning about those other cultural norms. The reason why we were kind of given this negative connotation, the ugly American, was because, well, there was a time when the only individuals that could travel abroad and do business with people overseas in other countries were the so-called elite of our culture, of our country. But then as the floodgates opened up for opportunity, and of course, really glad that they did, for more and more people to travel abroad, whether it was for leisure or for business, people traveled without taking the time to do what the so-called elite did of our culture, and that was taking the time to learn and educate ourselves about the cultural ways of living in other countries, the cultural norms that they have completely different from ours. That can be known as culture shock, when you experience the cultural practices of another person or another country or another place altogether, it being completely different from yours. It's culture shock. And unfortunately, there were some Americans, United States citizens, that when they traveled to other countries and didn't like what they saw with regard to cultural practices that were different from ours, were being very disrespectful of those cultural behaviors that they noticed and that they witnessed and experienced in those other countries. Saying things like, well, that's not how we operate here in the United States, or in our country, rather. That's not what we do. So that doesn't make any sense. I'm not doing it. I don't have to do it. And, being very rude about it, being very vocal and disrespectful to these other cultural behavioral norms that were different from theirs. It's more beneficial and more effective when you take the time to learn about another country's cultural behaviors and ways of operating and doing things, so that you can enhance the communication platform with them. You can enhance that business relationship, that personal relationship, when you learn about those cultural norms and work towards being accepting of it. If there's a reason why you don't like it, work towards understanding why you don't like it. Maybe you don't like it from the surface. In other words, you don't like it because of what you see right in front of your eyes. But once you start to learn about the cultural norms of that country, like, say, for example, in Indian culture and parts of Japanese culture, where the man is in the front seat of the car and the woman is in the back seat. And of course, at first glance, we might think, well, that feels demeaning to the woman or oppressive. It's like an oppressive nature. But don't you think it's just as important for us to learn why they do that? Why is it that there's that practice? In one circle, I've heard that when the man is walking in front of the woman or in the front seat, it's not so much a matter of her being considered second class, but him looking ahead, kind of exhibiting leadership, that if anything were to happen, it would happen to him before it would happen to her. At least in one circle, in communicating with a person of Indian descent, that I heard that explanation. But I'd be curious to know what all of you might think as far as that cultural practice is concerned. Then in some cultural platforms and methods of practice. Like, say, for example, in Japanese culture, if you're having a meeting with someone in Japan and you're considered to be the guest and they are the host, and let's say they invited you to lunch or dinner at a restaurant, well, the host is the one who sits facing the door. But you wouldn't know that unless you learned about Japanese customs, especially when it comes to Japanese customs of doing business, that they are the one that sits facing the door. So if you come into that meeting trying to make a great impression, getting there early before the host gets there, and you're the guest and you sit facing the door, you've offended the host. And in essence, there's a chance that they may not do business with you. And because Japanese culture also believe in saving face, which means that they don't believe that it's considered to be respectful to directly embarrass you or tell you about something that you were supposed to do that you didn't do. The expectation is that you would have taken the time to honor and learn their practices before doing so, before committing such an egregious act. So, in essence, instead of telling you those things and embarrassing you, saving face means that they would say something like, perhaps this is not the best time for us to do business. We should look at this later down the line, and pretty much just leave it at that. No other explanation. And in essence, they also don't believe in burning bridges, which means that this is just not a good time because you put a bad taste in our mouths right now, but it doesn't mean that we still can't do business at some point. So that's an example when it comes to Japanese culture. One thing that I learned when I took a trip to Montreal, Canada, was that I didn't know before that Montreal, Canada is a city that comprises of partially French speaking people and partially English speaking people. And literally the city, from my own experience and encounter, was divided. In essence, there was the French side and the English side. And one thing I came to learn about visiting Paris, France, was that the French are very passionate about their language. Like, you can have Parisians that speak fluent English just as much as French, but if you can't speak French, they will not communicate with you very much at all. They consider it to be a disrespect to their culture, especially if you're visiting their country. So what I found out about in Montreal was that if you went on a job interview and it was an English speaking job interview on the French side, that they would intentionally interview you in French. And if you can't speak the language, then you're not getting that job, even if it was a job that required you to speak English only, or you were given that impression. They would expect you to be able to speak French. Okay, so there are cultural practices that just because we don't understand them doesn't mean we have to disrespect them or demean them, or have this arrogance about ourselves as being United States citizens. That that's not how we operate in our country. And then comes the question of, well, how do we function? I mean, there are many of us that don't even know what the right hand represents when it comes to why we use the right hand to shake, and what it means to have a good firm handshake, as we discussed, that continental grab, and that the right hand represents truth, honor, honesty, integrity, and respect. There are many nonverbal cultural behaviors that we possess that don't have any specific meaning. Whereas in Japanese culture, and Indian culture, parts of African culture, that there are certain things that are done a specific way and have a specific meaning without saying a single thing. And that's also known as more of an implied law or an implied rule. It's not explicit. In other words, you're not going to see a sign that says this is how you're supposed to function or operate. This is what you're supposed to do. Pardon the sound in the background, if you can hear it. My wife is cooking, and I'm looking forward to dinner. But needless to say, moving forward, in an effort to become more acknowledged and focused and respectful of other cultures, it means to have an open mind, other cultural practices and behaviors. It also means to do our research before you do business or communicate with another country. Find out what their practices are, their cultural norms are, how they function, how they operate. That can go a very long way. And more importantly, being respectful, even if it comes down to cultural practices that you may not like or that may not make any sense to you. Okay. So it's important to do that because it helps us to become more culturally diverse. It builds on our own cultural identity and expands our own cultural horizons and quite naturally our own worldview. Now, most of the common cultural differences that exist, and particularly when it comes to understanding the differences between them and the challenges that we face, one are social customs. As I said before, it's the social customs in terms of practice with how things are done in one country compared to another, compared to the United States. Style of dress is also uniquely different in terms of cultural differences. Time, we're going to take a look at that one in a second because it's a big factor. Believe it or not, it is a cultural component when it comes to the perception of time, which, by the way, is considered, when it comes to this thing called locus of control, it's considered a stable factor. Locus of control measures the things that we can control in life versus the things we can't. Time is one of those components that we simply cannot control. But what we can do, it's a stable factor, but what we can do in terms of the control of time is we can control how we perceive it. We can control how we use that stable factor. It's a stable factor because hours are going to always be hours, minutes are going to always be minutes, and seconds are always going to be seconds, etc. But what we do in the course of that time is an important component. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Next, there's that tolerance for conflict and quite naturally gender roles in terms of how men function and how women operate or function can be deemed uniquely different, just as the example that I gave with like Indian culture or in Japanese culture. So let's take a look at time. Monochronic time, the perception is time is money, so it tends to be valued as more of a commodity and less of an opportunity to build relationships. And polychronic time, on the other hand, time is the substance of life, and what you do in the time you live is more important and more relevant than how much you do with the time in your day. So I ask you, when it comes to the difference between monochronic and polychronic time, where do we fall here in the United States? Quite naturally, for us, we're always on the go. We're worry warts when it comes to time, when it comes to trying to balance and juggle this thing called work-life balance with how much time we spend in a day doing work versus how much time we spend in a day just relaxing and spending time to ourselves, spending time with friends and family. And ultimately, there are times that we're just not good with time management. And it causes us to get very stressed out. We get upset when we're in a hurry and we got to run into traffic or there's somebody that's driving slow in front of us. Sometimes they're driving slow because they shouldn't be on the freeway, and other times they're driving slow because we're so concerned about driving so fast. Because they're actually going the speed limit, and we actually find ourselves in some cases getting upset about people who go the speed limit because we're not always good at managing our time and properly utilizing our time, and it stresses us out as a result. Because I guess when you really think about it, the sad thing is that when we're so concerned and so consumed with how we spend our day on a day-to-day basis in terms of time, that we miss life and life just passes us by in terms of really being able to appreciate and enjoy life itself, that before we know it, we become older and never really had the time or taken the time to enjoy ourselves in life, or taking the time to really relax and not be forced or rushed by time, or not be so heavily controlled by time. There are some people that can't even go on a vacation without scheduling it. Now, granted, I know that there are certain things that you put into a schedule, but imagine the stress of trying to squeeze too many activities in the course of a 3-day vacation because you want to get the most out of it. And in essence, you're not getting the most out of it. You're stressing yourself out trying to reach those deadlines, as opposed to just kind of, doing one or two things within the fair balance of that time and allowing yourself to just relax and be at peace with yourself. Where on the other hand, a polychronic culture, they look at time completely different. They're not always in a hurry to get to places on time or being on time. You may have come across these type of individuals that, they arrive in a meeting or at a meeting at a not at a specified time. Like if the meeting starts at 9 a.m., they may find themselves coming in at 9:30 or 9:45 because they're not going to allow time to stress them out to that extent that they have to be there right at that time. So in their culture, because they are not so bound by those strict guidelines, they tend to move a little slower in taking their time. And sometimes when we encounter that, we tend to get frustrated because we're wondering, where is everybody? This meeting was supposed to start at 9 o'clock. Or better still, why can't they hurry up, with getting this issue taken care of at this cash register? I got places to go and things to do. This is ridiculous, because they're not looking at time as the factor of how much you can get done as a stamp in the course of your day. But as a result, people that live under more polychronic rule or polychronic culture, they're not as stressed out as we are, which in essence causes them to live longer than we do. It's something to really think about. It doesn't necessarily mean that, with the hustle and bustle of how we operate on a daily basis, there should be moments that we take to put our phones away, to decompress, to put business dealings away or to the side, and just focus on ourselves, focus on our family and our friends, and focus on enjoying life. Like in small towns, for example, have you ever driven behind a tractor going 20 miles an hour on the road and you're getting frustrated trying to get around it versus that person that lives in that town that's just taking their time because this is just their way of life? People that live in the more rural areas of our country also more polychronic than monochronic because they're not in such a rush in terms of the course of their day, and they're able to really appreciate the day and taking a look at the perception of how you spend time in your life versus how you spend time in a day. I mean, which one do you think is going to have a greater benefit? Quite naturally, how much you spend time with the time of your day. But as I said before, quite naturally, with our culture being so fast paced and being so competitive in the United States, and time is money because we are so competitive, it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. That's not going to change. However, as I said before, the way that we function and operate in that space is what needs to be adjusted, is what needs to change to a certain extent. And as I said before, as I mentioned, be more realistic about how much you can do in the course of a day. I've had students in the past, for example, and I've even been down that road myself where I've scheduled something that starts, without any warning of any kind, or without any forethought. I would schedule something like, say, for example, a class that starts at 1:15, but I got off work at 12:30. And if and only if I didn't run into any traffic jams and things like that, unforeseen circumstances, if I didn't have to use the restroom as soon as I got off from work, I could immediately get in my car and I could immediately get there, and I should walk right through the front door with maybe 30 seconds to spare. That was stressful, extremely stressful. I've had students that have scheduled a 5:30 class, but they got off work at 5, but it took them 40 minutes to 50 minutes and sometimes an hour to get to class because the campus where they were getting out was on the other side of town from the class that they registered to go to. Very stressful, and it's just not a formula that works at all. But there are times that we find ourselves trying to squeeze so much into a glass, and that glass ends up spilling over so heavily to the point that we become overwhelmed. And that stress can lead to high blood pressure, it can lead to diabetes, it can lead to a myriad of health complications when we don't allow ourselves to be smart about how we utilize our time on a daily basis. Allow yourselves that time to appreciate and enjoy life as well. Don't get caught up so much to the point that you're so busy that you don't take the time to do just that. Okay, there are a lot of people, too many people out there, particularly in our culture. They work from night till day, they make a lot of money, but they don't have the opportunity to really enjoy the fruits of their labor. They don't have the time to enjoy their family. In other words, life just passes them by. And then by the time they retire, they're too tired to do anything because they put their body under so much stress over all of that time. Okay, so next, we'll look at high context cultures. And this will be one of the last things we'll look at. And we'll pick up from here when we start class on Tuesday. So, high context cultures rely heavily on subtle, often nonverbal cues to convey meaning, save face, and maintain social harmony. So they're the complete opposite of us, which is a low context culture. Meaning is discovered from the context in which the meaning is delivered. As I said before, certain things that are actually done as opposed to things that are actually said. Like in Chinese culture, the way that a business card is handled, as I've mentioned, they hand it to you with two hands and you receive it with two hands. You carefully examine it from front to back, and you don't put that business card away until you're done doing business with that person. And even the place that you put that business card, you don't just shove it in your pocket. It's best to put it in a business card holder and place it delicately and gently and with respect into that business card holder, because the implied rule or message there is that you understand that the way that you receive my business card is the way that you receive me as a professional. And ultimately, the way that we will interact is largely based on how you treat my card. Okay, so that means a great deal. And with regard to relying heavily on subtle, often nonverbal cues to convey meaning. And in essence, as I said earlier, in terms of Japanese culture, believing in saving face and not bringing shame upon the other person. Maintaining social harmony means that it's more relevant, it's more important that you are doing what's respectful for the good of everyone as opposed to your own self-interest. Okay, so in essence, as I said before, if your parents are expecting you to go to school to be a business person or to go to school to practice law because that's the family business, then there's no deviating from that, and you don't have that freedom to deviate. And if you do, then you can bring shame or embarrassment to your family. And in some cases, they may turn their backs on you or treat you differently as a result. Okay, so ultimately, maintaining social harmony also means that they don't challenge people in positions of authority. If there's something they disagree with, they respectfully accept it because of the idea that it is considered to be way too demeaning and disrespectful to tell that person what they said that they don't agree with or what they said was wrong. So thank you all for this conversation. And as I said before, we'll pick up where we left off moving forward. I do hope that you're making progress with your assignment that was given to you last week. We'll take a look at your progress, have a discussion about that on Tuesday as well. So with that being said, as I scratch my eye, I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day, and I will look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.